I stood hidden behind the slightly ajar mahogany door of the private study, while my hands gripped a silver serving tray so tightly that my knuckles turned a ghostly white. I am Blair, a 22-year-old who just graduated at the top of my class, yet I was currently lurking like a stranger in my own family's opulent Connecticut estate. Through the gap, I watched my father Dalton swirling a glass of vintage scotch while boasting to his wealthy associates about the bright future of my sister. He chuckled coldly before leaning in to whisper that raising me had been his only significant investment failure because I lacked the cutthroat social currency he valued. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked at my mother Colette, who merely adjusted her diamond necklace and nodded in silent agreement to maintain the family's prestigious facade. The air in the hallway felt suffocatingly thin when I heard him declare that he needed to cut off all my financial access immediately to prevent me from draining more resources. I had been accepted into Harvard Law School on my own merit, but my parents were now refusing to pay a single dime of my tuition because they deemed me a bad investment. I didn't cry or scream. Instead, I felt a strange, icy wave of calm wash over me as I realized the blood bond had finally dissolved into nothing more than a failed business contract. I stepped out from the shadows into the bright light of the study and walked straight toward the center of the room with a steady gaze that made the guests go silent. Without saying a word, I placed my family heirloom ring and my already deactivated black credit card onto the serving tray, right in front of my father's startled face. I let out a soft, sharp laugh that echoed against the high ceilings before announcing to the entire room that I was officially resigning from the family name. From this moment forward, I would never use another cent of their blood-stained inheritance, choosing instead to let them watch me build a legacy they could never own. If you have ever been undervalued or treated like a financial burden by the very people who were supposed to love you most, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to join our community of resilient survivors. Everything truly began on that fateful evening when the acceptance letter from Harvard University finally arrived at our prestigious address in Greenwich. I remembered the heavy silence that fell over the dining room as my father Dalton stared at the gold-embossed crest before flicking the paper toward the center of the table with utter disdain. He didn't offer a smile or a word of pride. Instead, he threw a printed tuition estimate right next to the letter and declared that he had no intention of wasting $60,000 a year on a legal degree. According to his cold logic, my passion for law offered zero strategic advantage to the family firm compared to the social connections my sister could build. Blake leaned back in her chair with a triumphant smirk, loudly recounting how Dad had already purchased a high-end luxury condo in Manhattan just for her social networking needs. She laughed at my shock and told me to accept that I simply didn't possess the innate charisma or social standing required to be a successful Vance. I attempted to explain the long-term value of a Harvard education for our family's legal protection, but Dad cut me off by reciting a list of cold, pragmatic profit margins that made my dreams feel like a clerical error. He looked me dead in the eye while stating that he refused to fund a vanity project for a daughter he considered his only failed investment. My mother Colette remained focused on her salad, only looking up to suggest that I should abandon Harvard in favor of a local community college where I could stay close to home. She calmly explained that my real priority should be finding a suitable marriage match among Dad's business partners to secure the family's influence for the next decade. When I looked at her for even a shred of motherly support, she merely sighed and adjusted her silk scarf while reminding me that maintaining our public image was far more important than my personal ambitions. The realization hit me like a physical blow that I was nothing more than a stranger living in a house built on transaction rather than affection. I didn't waste my breath begging people who saw me as a line item on a balance sheet, so I walked upstairs and began packing my life into 2 old suitcases. The house remained eerily silent as I dragged my bags down the grand staircase, passing the portraits of ancestors who probably would have been disgusted by such blatant greed. Blake stood by the mahogany door with her arms crossed, watching me with a look of pure satisfaction as I prepared to step out into the unknown. She leaned in close to whisper a final insult that I would never forget for as long as I lived. "Don't embarrass this family any further, Blair. Just accept that you don't have the qualities to be successful like me." I didn't give her the satisfaction of a response as I opened the front door and stepped out into the pouring rain without looking back at the life I was leaving behind. The heavy iron gates of the estate clicked shut with a finality that echoed through the empty street, while I checked the meager $200 stuffed into my pocket. My expensive clothes were quickly soaked through, but for the first time in 22 years, the air felt clean because I was no longer breathing the lies of the Vance household. I started walking toward the distant lights of the train station, knowing that the bridge back to my old life had been burned to ashes by my father's own hands. Every step away from that mansion felt like a victory, even though I had no idea where I would sleep once I reached the city. 6 months had passed since I severed all ties with my family and began my solitary existence in a damp basement apartment located in Queens, New York. The transition from a luxury estate in Greenwich to this cramped space felt like stepping into an entirely different universe where survival was the only priority. Every night at 10 o'clock, I dragged my exhausted body to a massive shipping warehouse on Long Island to work a grueling shift that lasted until 4 in the morning. This physically demanding labor was the only way I could afford the tuition for my first semester of law school without begging my father for mercy. I spent those long hours lifting heavy crates and scanning inventory codes, while my mind drifted toward the legal theories I was desperately trying to master. The only person who knew my secret location was my best friend Axel, who worked at a local bakery and refused to let me face this struggle alone. He arrived at my basement door almost every evening with a bag of leftover bread and pastries that his manager allowed him to take home after closing. Axel understood the pride that kept me from calling my mother, so he never judged the meager lifestyle I had been forced to adopt. During one of his visits, he brought over an old rusty bicycle that he had spent weeks repairing so that I could save money on subway fares. He even spent a Sunday afternoon fixing the broken window in my kitchen because the winter draft was making it impossible for me to study at night. The physical toll of this lifestyle was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore as I sat on the subway during my morning commute. I often found myself squinting at my law textbooks under the dim, flickering lights of the train car while other passengers slept soundly around me. My eyes felt like they were filled with sand from the lack of sleep, yet I forced myself to memorize case files before my morning classes at Harvard began. There were moments when the weight of the heavy crates at the warehouse seemed easier to bear than the complex legal arguments I had to prepare for my professors. I felt like I was living 2 separate lives that were constantly crashing into each other with no hope of a peaceful resolution. Everything reached a breaking point when I returned home one afternoon to find an urgent collection notice from the university's financial office tucked under my door. The letter stated that I had 30 days to settle my outstanding tuition balance for the upcoming semester, or my academic enrollment would be officially suspended. My heart sank as I stared at the balance, realizing that even with my double shifts at the warehouse, I was still thousands of dollars short of the required goal. Axel sat at my small wooden table and watched me struggle to keep my composure while I stared at the threatening red text on the paper. "Blair, you cannot survive on old bread forever, so please let me help you find a better position at a professional law firm," he said, while placing a supportive hand on my shoulder. I spent the rest of the night staring at the cracked ceiling and debating whether I should finally swallow my pride and call Dalton to ask for a loan. The thought of hearing his smug voice telling me that he was right about my failure made my stomach churn with a deep sense of nausea. I knew that calling home would mean giving up my freedom and accepting the transactional life my parents had planned for me since birth. However, the alternative was losing my place at Harvard and proving to everyone that I really was the bad investment my father claimed me to be. I clutched the collection notice until the paper wrinkled in my hand, caught between the crushing reality of poverty and the fierce desire to remain independent. At the start of my second semester during my freshman year, I was fortunate enough to secure a part-time office assistant position at a small law firm in the heart of Manhattan. This job was a significant upgrade from the dusty warehouse floors, as it provided me with a modest income while allowing me to breathe the air of the legal profession I so dearly loved. I spent my afternoons filing documents and organizing case files, but I soon realized that my access to the firm's legal research databases was a powerful tool I could use for my own protection. Every evening when the office grew quiet, I began teaching myself how to navigate complex financial records to trace the various business activities of Dalton. I spent countless hours cross-referencing public tax filings with the corporate structures I remembered seeing in the private study back in Greenwich. The investigation took a darker turn when Axel, who had been teaching himself basic data analysis to help me, discovered several suspicious tax filings linked directly to my legal name. We sat together in my dimly lit basement apartment while he pointed out a series of shell companies that Dalton was currently operating to evade federal taxes. My blood ran cold as I realized that my father had not only abandoned me financially, but was also secretly using my identity to facilitate his illegal financial schemes. The sheer audacity of his betrayal left me reeling with a mixture of profound shock and a cold, burning desire for absolute justice. Axel stayed by my side throughout the night as we carefully documented every instance where my signature had been forged on these fraudulent corporate documents. Instead of confronting my family immediately, I chose to play a much more strategic game by secretly copying every piece of incriminating financial evidence I could find. I purchased an encrypted thumb drive to store these digitized documents and kept it hidden as a personal insurance policy against any future threats from the Vance family. I knew that having these records was like holding a loaded weapon, but I also understood that I needed to wait for the perfect moment to reveal the truth. Every time I looked at the digital files, I felt a strange sense of empowerment that replaced the lingering fear of being homeless and destitute. This secret mission gave me a renewed sense of purpose that fueled my performance in my classes and my dedication at the law firm. One rainy afternoon, I attended a mandatory university seminar on business ethics, where the keynote speaker was the executive director of a major scholarship fund, Julian Sterling. I listened intently to his lecture on the importance of integrity in the financial world and found myself raising my hand to ask a complex question about corporate accountability. Julian Sterling seemed intrigued by my sharp analysis of current legal loopholes and spent nearly 20 minutes debating the finer points of financial law with me after the session ended. He looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and professional respect before handing me his private business card with a slight, knowing smile. "Miss Blair, your questions about financial loopholes make me think that you are in possession of some very valuable information," he remarked while observing my reaction closely. Before the seminar concluded, Julian Sterling pulled me aside to mention a specialized scholarship program he managed for students who demonstrated exceptional academic merit alongside extraordinary personal resilience. He explained that the Sterling Fund was specifically looking for future legal leaders who understood the weight of ethical responsibility in a world driven by profit. I felt a sudden surge of hope as I realized that this could be the permanent solution to my mounting tuition debts and my ticket to full independence. I promised him that I would submit a formal application immediately, sensing that this connection was the pivotal moment I had been waiting for since leaving Connecticut. As I walked back to the subway station, I felt the weight of the encrypted drive in my pocket and knew that the balance of power was finally beginning to shift in my favor. 1 year later, while I was deeply buried in the university library completing my early graduation thesis, I received an unexpected and unwanted phone call. Mom was on the other end of the line, her voice sounding unusually soft as she requested a meeting at a high-end cafe in the Upper East Side. I hesitated for a moment but decided to go, arriving in my modest student clothes, which stood in sharp contrast to the luxury surroundings. Upon entering, I immediately saw Blake sitting next to Mom, wearing an expensive designer dress and staring at me with a look of pure disdain. She didn't even bother to greet me. Instead, she spent several minutes eyeing my worn-out shoes while making a quiet, mocking sound under her breath. Colette wasted no time with pleasantries and began a practice speech about how much the family had missed me despite our previous disagreements. She leaned forward to explain that Dalton was facing some temporary financial hurdles that required a minor corporate reorganization to save the family firm. She pushed a set of legal documents across the marble table and insisted that my signature on these property transfer papers would solve everything. To make the deal more appealing, she promised that Dad would provide a small cash lump sum that would easily cover my remaining tuition fees. My mother kept touching my hand with forced affection while describing this as a golden opportunity for me to finally return to the Vance family fold. Having spent months studying corporate law and Dalton's shady business structures, I felt a deep sense of suspicion as I began scanning the fine print of the documents. I quickly discovered that this was not a simple property transfer, but rather a sophisticated legal trap designed to shift all liability for the shell companies onto me. If the federal authorities ever launched a formal investigation, these papers would ensure that I was the one legally responsible for all the tax evasion and fraud. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I realized my own parents were willing to sacrifice my future just to protect their own reputations. They weren't trying to bring me back into the family, they were simply looking for a convenient scapegoat to take the fall for their crimes. I looked directly at Colette before picking up the documents and slowly tearing them into small pieces right in front of her shocked face. I stood up and told her firmly that I was no longer the naive and easily manipulated daughter she once knew back in Greenwich. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the shredded paper falling onto the cafe floor, while Mom's face turned a pale shade of anger. I warned her that I had spent the last year learning exactly how to fight back against the kind of predatory tactics they were trying to use. The realization that their plan had failed miserably made Mom's hands tremble as she tried to gather the remnants of the useless legal papers. Blake's anger finally boiled over as she stood up and began insulting me loudly, drawing the attention of every other patron in the prestigious cafe. She called me a pathetic ingrate and a permanent stain on the Vance family legacy for refusing to help them in their time of need. Her voice was shrill with desperation as she accused me of being selfish for choosing my own path over the survival of the dynasty that raised me. She looked at my simple backpack and my messy hair with such hatred that I almost felt sorry for how much she relied on her status. Before I could turn to leave, she leaned across the table to deliver one final venomous remark that was meant to crush my remaining confidence. Blair, do you honestly think you can stand on your own in a city like New York without the power of the Vance name behind you? I offered her a calm, steady smile and told her that I had already been doing exactly that for the past year without any help from people like her. I walked out of the cafe and felt the cool New York air hit my face, feeling more powerful than I ever had while living in the mansion. The attempt to trap me only confirmed that Dalton was getting desperate and that my secret collection of evidence was becoming more valuable by the day. As I headed back toward the library, I knew that the next time I saw my family, it would be on my own terms in a place where their money couldn't save them. I had officially outgrown the shadow of their influence and was ready to finish what I started. 8 months before the graduation ceremony was scheduled to take place, I found myself standing in front of the towering glass skyscraper that housed the Sterling Foundation in downtown New York. I took a deep breath to steady my nerves before entering the elevator that would carry me to the final round of interviews for the most prestigious scholarship in the country. The doors opened to a boardroom filled with the city's leading financial experts and legal scholars who were all staring at me with expectant expressions. Julian Sterling sat at the head of the long mahogany table as the chairman of the committee, his sharp eyes observing every movement I made. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I realized that this single hour would determine whether my struggle over the past year would finally lead to a meaningful victory. I began my presentation by outlining a comprehensive proposal for a new system of transparent financial auditing designed to prevent corporate fraud within large family dynasties. To illustrate the practical necessity of my project, I used a series of anonymous case studies that were actually based on the illegal activities I had discovered within Dalton's firms. I detailed exactly how shell companies were being used to siphon off assets and evade federal taxes while leaving innocent employees and shareholders at significant risk. The judges leaned forward in their chairs as I explained the complex legal maneuvers required to dismantle such a sophisticated web of deception. Even though I never mentioned the Vance name out loud, I could see that Julian Sterling recognized the patterns from our previous conversation at the university seminar. The atmosphere in the room became noticeably more intense when one of the senior judges questioned why a daughter of the wealthy Vance family required any financial assistance from a public fund. I didn't flinch or look away as I answered his question with the raw and unfiltered truth about the night I was cast out of my home. I explained that my father viewed children as mere line items on a balance sheet and had discarded me the moment I stopped providing a strategic advantage. I told the committee that I had spent the last several months working in a warehouse and living in a basement to prove that my worth was not tied to a trust fund. The boardroom remained silent as I described the freedom I found in poverty compared to the golden cage of corruption I had left behind in Greenwich. Julian Sterling exchanged a series of knowing glances with the other board members before he finally stood up to address me directly in front of the entire committee. He noted that while my academic record was flawless, it was my unwavering integrity and the courage to expose systemic fraud that truly set me apart from other candidates. He looked at the other experts in the room and stated that the Foundation's primary mission was to invest in human character rather than just academic potential. I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders as he announced that I had been officially selected as the recipient of the full scholarship award. This package included $10,000 a month for my living expenses and a prestigious senior internship position directly within the Sterling Fund's legal department. The official announcement was followed by a firm handshake from Julian Sterling, who leaned in to offer a piece of advice that would stay with me forever. "We invest in people, Blair, not in the fraudulent numbers on your father's financial reports," he said, with a voice that conveyed both authority and genuine respect. I realized then that I had finally found a mentor who valued the very things that Dalton had mocked as my greatest weaknesses. The scholarship provided me with the financial security I needed to focus entirely on my final months of law school while preparing for the inevitable confrontation with my family. I was no longer a struggling student working in a warehouse, but a rising legal professional with the full backing of one of the most powerful men in New York. Immediately following the interview, Julian Sterling invited me into his private office to discuss a much more serious collaboration regarding the evidence I had collected. He explained that the Sterling Fund had been monitoring several of Dalton's suspicious acquisitions for years, but had lacked the internal documents necessary to build a solid case. I handed him the encrypted drive containing the records of the shell companies and the forged signatures that I had meticulously gathered during my time at the law firm. We spent the next several hours planning a legal strategy that would bring the entire Vance empire to its knees under the weight of federal law. As I walked out of the building that evening, I knew that the final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place for the justice I had been seeking since the rainy night I left Connecticut. 2 weeks before the graduation ceremony was officially scheduled to take place, Dalton and Blake arrived at my small apartment in a state of sheer panic. I was surprised to see their expensive sedan parked in front of my building as they practically burst through the entrance with desperate expressions. Dad didn't waste any time with greetings and immediately demanded that I withdraw the financial analysis reports I had sent to the federal investigators. He paced back and forth in my cramped living room while claiming that those documents were based on a misunderstanding of his corporate strategy. I watched him coldly as he explained that my role as an intern at the Sterling Fund gave me the power to influence the ongoing investigation in his favor. Blake was visibly trembling as she stood by the door and began crying while begging me not to ruin her future social standing. She sobbed about how a bankruptcy or a public scandal would cause her to lose her high-end condo and the luxury lifestyle she had worked so hard to maintain. According to her logic, my desire for justice was a direct threat to the inheritance she believed she deserved more than anyone else. She looked at the peeling wallpaper of my basement apartment and told me that I should be grateful that our father was even offering to speak to me again. I realized that she was only there because her own comfort was at risk, showing zero remorse for the fraudulent schemes that had nearly destroyed my life. Dalton suddenly changed his aggressive tone and moved closer to me with a manipulative smile that I had seen him use on countless business rivals. He promised to compensate me with a massive amount of money if I agreed to take full legal responsibility for the shell companies instead of him. He claimed that because I was young and had a clean record, I would likely receive a much lighter sentence than a prominent businessman like himself. My father even offered to set up a secret offshore account in my name so that I would be wealthy beyond my wildest dreams once the legal trouble passed. It was a chilling moment as I looked at the man who raised me and realized he still viewed me as a pawn that could be purchased with a checkbook. I stood my ground and looked directly into his eyes before refusing every single one of his insulting offers with absolute clarity. I told him that my integrity was not for sale at any price because I had already learned how to survive without a single penny from the Vance estate. The anger in my voice was steady as I demanded that they both leave my apartment immediately before I contacted the police to report their presence. Dalton's face turned a dark shade of purple when he realized that his usual tactics of bribery and intimidation were having no effect on my resolve. He grabbed Blake's arm and moved toward the exit, but he stopped for a brief second to deliver one final and hollow warning. His voice was thick with venom as he threatened to use every single one of his professional connections to ensure I never found a job anywhere in the United States. He shouted that he would make sure the name Blair Vance became synonymous with betrayal, so that no reputable law firm would ever dare to hire me. I simply offered him a calm and steady smile while remembering the encrypted files that Julian Sterling and I had already processed for the federal authorities. I reminded him that he was the one who had once called me a bad investment and told him to prepare for the consequences of that mistake. You called me a bad investment, Dalton, so now prepare to watch that investment cost you everything you have ever owned, I stated while closing the door firmly in their faces. The silence that followed their departure felt like a victory because I had finally stood up to the people who had tried to crush my spirit for years. I sat down at my small desk and felt a sense of peace, knowing that the truth was finally moving toward a public revelation. My struggle in the warehouse and the long nights of studying in the basement had prepared me for this exact confrontation with the ghosts of my past. The empty threats of a desperate man no longer had any power over me because I had built a new life on the foundation of my own hard work. I knew that the upcoming graduation ceremony would not just be about my degree, but it would also be the day the Vance dynasty finally faced the justice it deserved. Early on the morning of May 17th, brilliant sunlight covered the Harvard University campus in the presence of thousands of attendees who had gathered for the commencement ceremony. I stood backstage and adjusted my graduation gown while feeling a profound sense of calm that I had never experienced during my years in Greenwich. The air was filled with the sound of the university orchestra and the excited chatter of families celebrating the academic achievements of their children. When my name was finally called as the valedictorian of the law school, I walked toward the podium with a steady gait and a clear mind. Julian Sterling stood at the center of the stage with a proud smile as he prepared to present me with the highest academic honor of the year. I looked out into the vast sea of faces and immediately spotted Dalton, Collette, and Blake sitting in the guest section with expressions of pure shock and humiliation. They looked completely paralyzed as they realized that the daughter they had once discarded and called a bad investment was now the star of the entire university. Colette tried to hide her face behind a designer program, while Blake stared at me with a mixture of intense jealousy and visible disbelief at my success. Dalton sat rigidly in his seat with his jaw clenched, likely realizing that his threats of blacklisting me had failed to stop my professional ascent. I took a moment to look directly at them before I began my speech, which focused on the necessity of personal accountability and the power of individual truth. I publicly declared my total financial and legal independence from the Vance family estate, while emphasizing that my achievements belonged to me alone. The audience listened in stunned silence as I explained that a person's true value is forged in the fires of adversity rather than inherited through a corrupt lineage. As I concluded my remarks, I signaled to a group of federal investigators who were waiting at the edge of the ceremony grounds near the main exit. I had already coordinated with Julian Sterling to ensure that the final evidence of Dalton's financial crimes was handed over at this exact moment of maximum public exposure. I watched from the podium as the officers approached my father and quietly informed him that he was being taken into custody for multiple counts of fraud and tax evasion. The sight of Dalton being led away in handcuffs while the university cameras were still rolling was the final blow to the Vance family reputation. Colette and Blake were left standing in the middle of the crowd as the prestigious world they had built on lies began to crumble around them. The once powerful dynasty was now nothing more than a headline in a criminal investigation that would soon lead to their total bankruptcy. The aftermath of that day brought a sense of absolute liberation as I officially completed the legal process to change my name and sever my last connection to Dalton's legacy. The news of the arrest spread through the high society circles of Connecticut like a wildfire, resulting in Blake being immediately expelled from her elite social clubs and sororities. Without the protection of my father's stolen wealth, she was forced to face the harsh reality of the life she had mocked me for living just a few months prior. I started my full-time career at the Sterling Fund, with a bright future ahead of me and the respect of the entire legal community in New York. My journey from a damp basement in Queens to the top of my class at Harvard had finally reached its triumphant conclusion. I stood in my new office overlooking the city and realized that the struggle had been the greatest investment I ever made in myself. And reflecting on everything I had endured, I realized that the value of a human being does not lie in the recognition of their family, but in their own relentless effort. I had proven that no amount of inherited wealth could ever match the power of a person who is willing to work hard and maintain their integrity. My second major lesson was that truth and honesty are the strongest weapons one can use against any form of financial oppression or personal manipulation. I was no longer Blair Vance, the girl who was defined by her father's expectations, but a woman who had built her own destiny through grit and determination. As the sun set over Manhattan, I looked forward to a life where my worth was measured only by my character and my contributions to justice. I had finally found the peace that comes from knowing I had won the war on my own terms.
Trước khi khép lại câu chuyện của Brian ngày hôm nay, các bạn đừng vội bỏ qua những giây phút cuối này, bởi lẽ hành trình của cô ấy không chỉ là một màn trả thù ngoại ngục, mà còn là tấm gương phản chiếu những góc khuất tàn nhẫn trong tư duy thực dụng của nhiều gia đình hiện đại. Tôi tin rằng sai lầm lớn nhất của ông Dalton không phải là kinh doanh gian lận, mà là việc định giá tình thân bằng con số lợi nhuận khô khan. Trong cuộc sống, con cái vốn là những hạt mầm cần sự vun tưới, chứ không phải là những mã cổ phiếu để cha mẹ cân đo đếm lãi. Bài học đắt giá ở đây chính là giá trị tự thân của bạn được định nghĩa bởi sự nỗ lực và sự liêm chính của chính bạn, chứ không nằm ở sự công nhận của những người coi thường bạn. Dù đó có là người thân ruột thịt, đừng bao giờ cho phép ai đó dán nhãn bạn là một khoản đầu tư tồi. vì họ không nhìn thấy tiềm năng vô hạn bên trong con người bạn.